Well, let's do this. The topic is morality, objective or subjective. And why don't you start? Why don't you just give a 5-ish minutes, whatever works, on what your basic view is and why you hold it to be subjective, or whatever the technical terms are that you're going to employ.
Fine by me. The terms can be a bit confusing, I think, objective and subjective. I'm usually careful to clarify that I'm not really a moral subjectivist, because subjectivism is a sort of theory of ethical truth that says things are true or false dependent on mental states. Things are true because you want them to be true, or in some way dependent on your desires or values or something like this. I broadly subscribe to an ethical view called Emotivism, which doesn't quite say this. What it says is that ethical statements are expressions of emotion. So when you make an ethical statement, when you say that murder is wrong, you're expressing a kind of emotion. This is a view that's been popularly held by a number of people. It was, in the 20th century, most closely associated with A.J. Ayer and his philosophy of logical positivism, which has largely gone out of favor for being self-defeating and not capturing a lot of what philosophy is about. But I think that the emotivist part can be salvaged and remains a powerful critique to moral objectivism. To be clear, if you were to say murder is wrong, I think the best way of getting at what your metaethics is to translate that into a different phrase that doesn't use the word wrong and see what you're actually trying to say. So, murder is wrong, that might translate as something like, I don't like murder. That's not emotivism, that's moral subjectivism. Because to say I don't like murder is just to report a fact. It's just a fact, it's a true fact about my brain that I don't like murder. And so me saying murder is wrong, reporting that, would just be making a claim about my psychology. That's not what emotivism is. Emotivism says that when you say murder is wrong, you are expressing the dislike itself. So saying murder is wrong is not the same thing as saying I don't like murder. It's expressing the dislike. So A.J. Ayer famously had it as murder is wrong translates roughly to something like boo murder. You can think of it as the difference between saying murder and saying murder is wrong is like the difference between writing down murder and then writing down murder with an exclamation mark and an angry emoji. It adds something, it tells you something about the mental state of the person you're speaking to, but it doesn't add anything propositional. It doesn't change, it's not the kind of thing that can be true or false. This is the most radical thing about emotivism. It means that moral claims don't have truth value. They can't be true and false. The emotivist recognizes that if you pay attention to what's going on when you have a moral feeling, when you see a homeless person being kicked for no reason, what happens in your brain? Well, you've seen a set of objective facts. You can say a person has been kicked. That's true. It doesn't do anything moral. You could say, I don't like that this person has been kicked. That's reporting a psychological fact. Again, nothing moral, you're just stating facts. But there's this added element, there's this added thing that you feel, and it's something like don't. It's something like stop. It's something like boo. All of these things are not things that can have truth value. They're emotions. One of the ways that I would describe this is to imagine that we didn't have a word for anxiety, the feeling of anxiety. Imagine there was just no such word for it, and you were feeling anxious, and you were trying to describe to somebody how you felt. And you would say, well, it's a bit like being sad, but it's kind of like being excited at the same time. It would be difficult to explain. You could offer these analogies, but it's its own unique feeling. And what we've done is we've sort of identified that feeling and given it a name, which is anxiety. Now, that thing that you feel, that thing that makes things you consider to be immoral different from other kinds of events, whatever that thing is, I think we've also identified that emotion, put a label on it, and that label is good or bad, or right and wrong, virtuous, not virtuous, these kinds of terms. I think they apply to an emotion. So a confusion about emotivism is that good and bad sort of map on to other emotions. So when you say something is good, you mean to express pleasure, or how impressed you are, or something like that. These are all just analogies. It is its own unique, sui generis emotion. It just belongs in that category. So when Ayer says boo murder, he doesn't mean that's what murder is wrong means. It just means something a bit like that. That's the best way of translating it into other emotive language. But whatever this wrong thing is that you feel, it belongs in that category of emotion. That's my view of emotivism. And I'll pass it on to you, but I will say that The principal challenge that I have for an objectivist about ethics is to say we observe this world. There's a bunch of people in the room right now. I can see and observe certain things. I can see a table and a chair. I can hear voices. I can experience the air. I can feel it on my face. I'm told that somewhere in this room, maybe it's in our brains, maybe it's in the air between us, that there's this thing called ought, called should, called good, that somewhere exists, maybe immaterially. There's a problem if you're a materialist, if you only believe in material things, you don't really have that option available to you. It has to be somewhere in this room, or somewhere on this earth. There's this thing in the universe called good and bad, and all I'm asking is, firstly, what is that thing, if not just an emotion? And secondly, where does it come from?
That's a very fair question and a great challenge to moral objectivists. I would hazard a response to that myself, but first of all, I'm curious what his opponent is going to say. And more importantly, I feel undecided about these two things myself. I can see the pros and cons of either side of these arguments, and it's just really difficult to figure out which one of them is more compelling. The main issue I have with emotivism is the fact that it seems to leave no room for a definite moral judgment about something, because after all, if every judgment is based off of our subjective emotions, then what gives me the right to criticize someone else's emotions or whatever actions are emanating off of those emotions? And with that logic, I'm not quite sure how we can come up with any unified or cohesive framework on which we can all agree on, given that everybody is going to have different emotions, and even within ourselves, we have fluctuating emotions all the time. So on one day, I might think something is wrong. On the other day, I might think it's right. How do we come up with any idea of morality that transcends any individual's opinions, subjectivity, or emotions? I'm not sure how emotivism would respond to that. On the other hand, as I said, that's a very fair challenge he's posing to moral objectivists, because how do we go from the experiences that we can observe, we can quantify, the facts of life that we can all definitely agree on because we all share these senses, to what we ought to do without the vehicle of emotions? Without emotions, how do we decide what is right and what is wrong exactly? I think that's the question he's asking here. Let's see how they answer that.
It has to be somewhere in this room, or somewhere on this earth. There's this thing in the universe called good and bad, and all I'm asking is, firstly, what is that thing, if not just an emotion?
Thank you. That was very concise. All right, so I'm just going to give primarily a positive case for why I think morality is objective, and then I'll address a little bit of the challenge there at the end, which I think will kind of flow out of what I present. So either we need evaluative terms like good, bad, should, shouldn't, right, wrong, or we don't. It's either or. And if we don't need them, then we should stop using them because they don't serve any purpose. If we do need them, then the reason why we need them is going to shed a lot of light on what their referents are in reality. The reason why we need them, the facts that give rise to our need of them, are going to tie them to reality. Those are the facts to which they refer. So for instance, if I say that murder is wrong, I am using the term wrong there to refer to some fact in reality. What is that fact? And this is where Ayn Rand's, as many of you know, I'm an advocate of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. But this is where Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism comes in. And it comes in two ways. First of all, I'm going to discuss a little bit about how she anchored morality in reality by identifying the factual requirements of human life as the standard of moral value. And then I'm going to use what I term the Ayn Rand question, which you're going to hear me use repeatedly in this discussion, I think, and that is, what facts of reality give rise to the need of this term we are using? Either there are facts that support a term and make it necessary for us to communicate ideas, or there are no facts, in which case it's just an arbitrary term, we have no need for it. So why do we need evaluative terms? Why do we need the term value? What does it refer to? Well, Rand identifies the fact that a value, in the way that we use it, just in plain language, means something that you go after, something you act to gain or keep. You value money, you value an education, you value a relationship, an education, or if you're religious, you value God. So you go to church because you're after a relationship with God. So before we even have a standard of morality, value simply means objects that we go after, objects of action. And she says, well, why do things go after objects? Why does anything go after things like that? And she observes that only one kind of thing goes after objects, and that is living beings, right? And this is not just humans, but living beings in general, antelopes, cats, birds, and humans, and also flowers and trees, right? And what do? They go after something. If it's a tree, it burrows its roots into the ground, it turns its leaves toward the sky. If it's an antelope, it goes after its food and it runs away from the lion, and so forth. What's going on here? Only living things go after values, non-living things don't, right? So value, Rand says, is not a primary. It presupposes an answer to the question of value to whom and for what. So this contrasts with like A.J. Ayer, more specifically actually with G.E. Moore, who would hold that good is a primary, it's undefinable primary. Rand says it's not an undefinable primary. Good to whom and for what? If something is good, it has to have a being to whom it is good. And then there's got to be a reason why it's good. And Rand says the same about values. So she says only living things go after values. And then she says, well, the to whom is answered by the thing going after the value, right? A bird is going after a worm. The worm is a value to the bird. Why is it going after the bird? What difference does it make if the worm doesn't get the worm? And Rand keeps going, and she says, if we keep looking at reality, at all the living things that go after values, what we see is that the reason they go after values is in order to remain alive. And she arrives at this very fundamental conclusion. There's only one fundamental alternative in the universe, existence or non-existence, and it pertains only to living organisms. A living thing can go out of existence, or its life can go out of existence. When something dies, that's what happens. Its chemical elements remain, but its life is gone. And she identifies that this is the very foundation that gives rise to the possibility of and the need of values. A thing can't go after values unless it's alive, and if it is to remain alive, it must go after values. In identifying this fact, Rand has demonstrated that life is the root, the ultimate foundation of the concept of value and of all evaluative concepts. Why do we need the concept ought or should or shouldn't? What do they refer to? In Rand's view, and I agree with her, they refer to the actions, you ought to do this, refers to an action that you should take if you want to remain in existence. Now, obviously, human beings, well, this may not be obvious because I think Alex disagrees with me on this, but I hold, and Rand holds, that we do have free will, that free will is the capacity to activate your mind or not, to think or not to think. And we need to think in order to live, so we need guidance in how to use our facts.
The point he was just making about how we're able to anchor values and morality to facts is something that I've heard echoed by Sam Harris, who is a famous podcaster and neuroscientist, amongst other things. The point he made is basically that well-being defines everything in life that we strive towards. It's a pretty broad term, but intentionally so because of how difficult it can be to determine what is optimal for our flourishing. But the fact that it's not always precise, the fact that we might sometimes ebb and flow on what is considered moral or valuable, does not take away from that fact that certain things are more conducive to that than others. So as he describes it, it's more of a navigational problem in which we're trying to figure out which path leads towards the ideal. When it comes to well-being, he draws a sharp contrast to illustrate the parts of that spectrum that is not so ambiguous, the part that we can easily anchor back to as sort of evidence that we're not simply arbitrarily coming up with these objective or these moral objective ideas, but rather that they're always anchored to something more tangible than that. How he does this is by saying that on the one hand, we have the extreme bad. The extreme bad, everybody would agree, is a living hell where misery is infinite, everybody is experiencing it, and everybody is in the maximum amount of pain possible, where there is absolutely no glimmer of hope. There is just constant misery. That is a form of well-being that needs no debating or subjectivity because everybody can probably agree about that. I mean, I don't think anybody would disagree about that unless they're insane, in which case we're having a different conversation. But on the other hand, we can imagine the flip of that where everybody is just maximally flourishing. Everybody is happy. There's no pain. There's no suffering. Everyone is just satisfied and living a blissful existence. According to him, that is the most objective form of well-being. And everything in between he describes as peaks on different mountains. So he's not maintaining that there's only one form of well-being, but he maintains there's different peaks and different troughs when it comes to these well-being, these states of well-beings and these states of absolute misery and all the ranges between them. So just as a mountain range, we might see some mountains higher than others, but we might also have mountains that are equal. There might be different conditions that come together to create a well-being that other people might not be able to understand and that they might actually feel is a form of misery. But because of the conditions that have coalesced into that, it makes it more or less a part of what we might consider well-being. Craig Biddle is essentially doing the same thing while echoing Ayn Rand, but they seem to be using life and death as the contrast. I'm not quite sure that those are the most optimal state of well-being, is simply being alive. I've actually heard some people make a pretty compelling argument about why not being alive is no different from well-being, essentially, because you're not exposed to all of this suffering. But I think that's a different conversation. Perhaps I'll pick that up on some other day. But the point here is that I think at some point in a suffering being, it's actually more generous. It's actually more kind to end that life. So given that, I'm not sure I would agree with life and death as the sort of objective things that we can anchor values and morality to. But I do see where he's going with this, because after all, it is in life throughout our evolutionary period that we have developed all of these instincts that either maintain well-being or deteriorates it.
And we need to think in order to live. So we need guidance in how to use our faculty of thinking, our rational faculty, so that we can live. So once she has designed or derived this principle that the factual requirements of human life constitute the standard of moral value. Now, life is the standard for any living thing, but for human beings, because we have free will, moral values are chosen values. If you choose to live, and this is the last thing I'll say on this point, and then I'll address some of your other concerns. If you choose to live, now we do have this choice, you can, as an adult at least, you can choose to go out of existence. You can choose, I don't want to do this anymore, I'm gonna die, or take my own life. But if you choose to live, then after that choice is made, at least in terms of logical hierarchy, after that choice is made, you need the things that will enable you to live. We call those values, and then we call the actions that you take to get values virtues. And this is the way that Rand then starts to build a life-based morality on this standard of value of life that I think she has actually derived inductively, albeit. So this is, and I know that there's some controversy in that. But I think she generalizes correctly, and that the very reason that values can exist and that we need to pursue them is because we are alive. So this is the basic meta-ethics. Meta-ethics is a technical term, just meaning how do we know the meaning of the terms that we're using in ethics? And then normative ethics is what should we do and why? What are the principles? So they're two different sets, but those are just technical terms. But that's basically the beginning of the underpinning for that. Now, there's much more I could say, but I want to pause. As to your concern that there's got to be an ought in here somewhere, Rand makes a really interesting distinction that I think helps with this. The normal way that people have thought about objectivity versus subjectivity has been that subjective means you just made it up, it's just in here. It's just arbitrary. And objective means it's out there somewhere. You know, like Plato's form of the good, right? That would be out there. Or God in the Christian view. It's out there, and so you get the commandments, or you get a revelation. And Rand said this is a false alternative, and it's a really problematic way of thinking about what objective is. So she came up with a trichotomy, and she said there is the subjective, which is just sort of going by whims or whatever you feel like doing. There's the intrinsic, which is the term she uses for the idea that the good is out there, detached from human beings, detached from our cognitive needs and from our needs at all. And it just sort of imprints on us, and then we have to do it, God's commandments or something like that. And she says the proper way to use the concept of objective is that the objective is the connection between the mind in here and a fact out there. And in this case, what she's saying is, we are recognizing the fact that it is only life that makes the concept of values possible or necessary. And then she makes this final point. To use evaluative terms detached from life is to commit a fallacy that she called the concept of the fallacy of the stolen concept. It is to tear evaluative terms away from the very base that gives them meaning and ties them to reality. So it's a conceptual fallacy as against a logical fallacy. It's an abuse of a concept. And I think this is really enlightening. It is for me. It's like, yeah, if life really is the base and the root of all of this, and you tear the concept of value or should away from it, and then use that with utter disregard to its roots, you have stolen that concept away from there. So anyway, this is just a primer on the reason I think it is. So the ought in this room is the recognition of the fact that given our nature, we have to act in certain ways in order to live. And if we don't act successfully in those ways, we can't live.
Sure.
That is such an interesting insight, a trichotomy. I've never come across that before, but I'm not sure that I would agree there is anything such as subjectivity, because I would describe subjectivity essentially as his refined version of objectivity, because subjectivity, in my opinion, is always contingent upon environmental factors. There's no emotion we feel that exists untethered from our environment, whether that's other people or things and facts of life. So I think there's only intrinsic and objective, but just to understand what he's saying there's subjective, which is essentially whatever is happening inside us, independent of the outer world. There is objective, which, as I said, is the interplay between who we are, our emotions, and the environment. And then there's intrinsic, which is the conventional idea that people think about when we think about objective. So for him, intrinsic is what exists out there, independent of what we think about it. It has some value. It's the God who is imputing morality onto things, independent of whether we exist or not. It's that idea of, again, it's the conventional idea of objectivity, which is what he's calling intrinsic, right? So given these terms, let's see how he's able to make his case going forward with them.
So anyway, this is just a primer on the reason I think it is. So the ought in this room is the recognition of the fact that given our nature, we have to act in certain ways in order to live. And if we don't act successfully in those ways, we can't live.
Sure. If that's the basis of ethics, there are lots of questions I want to ask about different things you've said there, but I suppose a place to start, to sort of throw a dart, as it were. If ethics requires the prospect of living and dying, that is to say that were you not a living being who could choose certain courses of action which would cause you to die, ethics cannot exist, if I understand you correctly?
Yes, she actually said that explicitly, that ethics applies, well, values apply only to living things, and ethics apply only to volitional living things.
Then I'd like you to imagine for a second an immortality pill that is discovered, invented by scientists, and perhaps to avoid some kind of overpopulation crisis, everybody sterilized at the discovery of this miraculous wonder drug. And at least some people take it, and they'll now live forever. And forget for a moment the sort of physical restrictions on this, the heat death of the universe. There's probably some way to imagine avoiding this inevitability. These people live forever. They're not going to die. Perhaps they're transported to some afterlife where they get to live forever in the New Jerusalem. Does ethics cease to exist? Does it no longer matter how I treat my fellow creature because the prospect of life and death is no longer on the table? That seems highly implausible to me.
Well, Craig said that trap for himself when he used life and death as a way to connect morality to facts. Alex's question would not have been relevant had Craig used suffering instead, which is personally what I think is a stronger axiom when making that, argument about how we can tie morality to facts. Because the theoretical example that Alex just gave assumes a world in which life and death is no longer an issue. But in such a world, suffering is still an issue. So unless Craig pivots to use suffering as the axiom, he has to figure out a different idea, a different means by which we can root morality to facts without life and death itself. And I hope Craig doesn't cop out of this question by simply saying that's a fictional world you just created, because the essence of the question is really that life and death is not as paramount in the prosperity of human beings as Craig seems to be suggesting here. So let's see how he answers this.
Does it no longer matter how I treat my fellow creature because the prospect of life and death is no longer on the table? That seems highly implausible to me.
Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, believe it or not, Ayn Rand uses the very example you're bringing up in her essay, The Objectivist Ethics. She says, suppose there's an immortal robot.
But the robot makes it...
Yeah, I guess it's not identical. So people still can die?
Yep. Okay. No, sorry. People can't die, but they're still people. This is the thing. Ayn Rand's robot is this sort of non-volitional, sort of material thing that just sort of exists. And that thing doesn't have ethics. And I think that everybody would agree quite intuitively that if something is dead, this table, it can't have ethics. It, of course, doesn't follow that if something is not dead, it can. What I'm looking for is, well, I suppose evidence of that is actually a separate thing. I'm just granting for a moment that that's the case, that ethics does rely on life and the prospect of courses of action that will lead to your death, and saying, take Ayn Rand's immortal robot, but turn it into an immortal person who still has free will, even though you're right, I don't believe in it, but again, I'll just grant it for the sake of this, can still suffer, still cares, still has emotions.
I actually disagree with Craig on the free will part as well. So here I actually agree with Alex, but I'm not quite sure how that disagreement affects my agreement with Craig on his moral objectivity, notwithstanding the fact that I would use suffering as a way to, anchor that to facts as opposed to the life and death that he's using. But I'm glad Alex is noting that and moving on anyways, because perhaps it's a separate conversation that is not too relevant to the core of the, their argument here.
And saying, take Ayn Rand's immortal robot, but turn it into an immortal person who still has free will, even though you're right, I don't believe in it, but again, I'll just grant it for the sake of this, can still suffer, still cares, still has emotions. If we were suddenly immortal and I were causing somebody that you cared about to suffer in front of me, and you told me to stop, I'd say, well, your moral import is gone because none of us can die anymore, so the suffering that they're experiencing can't be called immoral.
Yeah.
It might emotively matter to
Alex finally used that word I was looking for, which is suffering. He's asking, in the absence of death, which is what you're using as an anchor between morality and facts, are you saying that we're incapable of ascribing moral judgments on something, even something like suffering?
because none of us can die anymore, so the suffering that they're experiencing can't be called immoral.
Yeah.
It might emotively matter to you, but then, of course, if you wanted to start using that as any kind of moral prescription, you'd be jumping over to my side of the fence. So, where does this ethical force that I think most people in this room probably intuitively would still feel in that immortal situation come from?
Yeah, good question. Anytime there is a constructed experiment like this that is outside the realm of possibility as we know it, right? So the ring of Gyges, sometimes people bring it up. What if you had the ring of Gyges?
He's doing what I was hoping he wouldn't do. He's going to dismiss this argument because it's a theory, which I think completely defeats the essence of the question. Now, O'Connor could not have asked this same question about suffering. If he had asked, if we lived in a world where there is no suffering, are you saying that there is no ethics? Well, of course, there's no suffering, so there's no ethics. There's nothing for people to place value on because nobody's going to feel any pain. Everybody is either neutral or enjoying. So yes, but Craig isn't able to bite on that question because he's using a much more flimsier anchor here. And I'm afraid he's now going to avoid the question as well.
Anytime there is a constructed experiment like this that is outside the realm of possibility as we know it, right? So the ring of Gyges, sometimes people bring it up. What if you had the ring of Gyges? Wouldn't you go around and rape and kill people then? And I always say, well, look, what's the purpose of this mind experiment when we're trying to figure out ethics for where we are here in this world living the way that we are? So the first thing I would say to this request is that not a lot hangs on it, if anything hangs on it, because no matter how I answer it, we still are not immortal, and we have to figure out how to live as human beings. Ethics is a practical subject. It's something that we need because we have to make life and death decisions and decisions that are going to help us or harm us in life, how to set up relationships, businesses, societies, and all of that. So when we go to a wonderland of sorts and say, well, suppose that's not the case, but this other thing is the case, what would you do then? We're now really not dealing with ethics anymore. We're simply dealing with a different situation. Now, that said, I'll answer the question this way.
Yes, you still have to answer the question. It's a thought experiment. No one thinks we live in such a world or we're going to live in such a world. But his answer to that is going to be illuminating on exactly how much primacy we can put on death, which is not much, which is what Alex is observing here. And Alex is giving him a red point and signal that suffering, this is what you should be looking at. This is something that I can't argue with any fictional universe, that if you take away, your idea of ethics falls apart. But Craig still hasn't seen that glowing arrow sign, so he's still fumbling as far as I can tell.
Now, that said, I'll answer the question this way. If human beings could both be immortal, there's no way they could die, and yet they still have feelings and desires and can experience pain and joy, I think that ethics would still exist. It would just exist in a very different way than it does now. The right and wrong would not be about keeping you alive. It would be about making life simply the very best it could be, which, by the way, ethics is about now too, because living, the point according to the objectivist ethics, the point of ethics is not just to keep you alive, it's to keep you alive and enable you to flourish, to live to the fullest extent that you can,
finally,
given your potentials, to really enjoy this one and only life that you have.
What would be that standard of
if you were to take away the
death,
if you take away the death
element,
then I guess you'd just be able to enjoy things forever and just never have that stop.
So it would become like a hedonistic theory of ethics. It would become about maximizing pleasure.
It would become about maximizing flourishing.
Okay.
So you would, instead of living just, in a mundane way, you would want to live in the richest way possible. But I wouldn't call it hedonism, because I don't think that mere pleasure is what makes human life interesting.
Sure. Whatever we want to.
Now he's finally converged with my point of view on this. He took the scenic route, but I'm glad we finally meet.
I don't think you would want to live in the richest way possible, but I wouldn't call it hedonism, because I don't think that mere pleasure is what makes human life interesting.
Sure. Whatever we want to call it, it seems to me, therefore, that if you can have a concept of flourishing and value, and indeed ethics, even if it's ethics of a different kind, without life and death, then I suppose I would look with suspicion upon your earlier supposition that
life would no
ethics
longer
requires.
be. Life couldn't be the. If you can't die, life can't be the standard of value. But that's why I oppose. That's why I oppose the.
Suppose, for example, and I understand. I mean, a lot of people have this reticence to engage in thought experiments, and I understand it because they seem sort of wishy-washy and a bit out there. But they're tools in the way that, like, you might have a really, really long, convoluted mathematical syllogism, which seems to be super impractical and totally weird, but somehow whatever it juts out at the end gives you some kind of practical wisdom. So, but if you prefer, if you want a more imaginable, conceivable example, then suppose instead of living forever, everybody is immortal up to a point, and everybody knows their death date. Like everybody on their 25th birthday, it gets killed, and they know there's no way to avoid it for whatever reason. They know the time, the place, the date that they're going to die 100%, and they know they can't die before, and they know they're not going to live any longer. This doesn't require this sort of strange vision of immortality and sort of universal conquest and avoiding the heat death. It seems to me that as long as it is even possible to say that there is such a thing as value in ethics in either of those situations, we cannot say that in principle ethics is about life.
So this is where I absolutely disagree, because you are taking fanciful, thought experiments that do not happen, and as far as we know, cannot happen. Mm-hmm. So you're.
See, Alex is drawing Craig back to his previous argument about life and death, because that is far more easier as an argument to break down, which, as far as I can tell, is what he's done. But Craig is still biting on that. He's not letting go of that. He's not pivoting to this stronger argument of suffering, which obviously Alex so far has not been able to come up with anything for, except to say that perhaps that's hedonism. But Craig made a pretty easy point there that no, we're not exactly talking about hedonism here. I wish Craig would stick to this suffering thing. I think that life and death argument is too flimsy, right? It's too easy for Alex to break this one down. And now they're getting bogged down about the utility of thought experiments to boot.
So this is where I absolutely disagree, because you are taking fanciful, thought experiments that do not happen, and as far as we know, cannot happen. Mm-hmm. So you're treating a metaphysical impossibility as the environment within which we need to investigate ethics.
Well, suppose you would say...
let me just finish this thought, though, because I really think that's the wrong way to go about it. So I want to give you a hypothetical.
Sure.
Suppose we lived in this world, mm-hmm. and suppose human beings were mortal, yep. and suppose that they could either live beautiful, happy lives if they acted in certain ways, or miserable lives if they acted in other ways, or simply die if they didn't succeed in achieving their values. And there was a moral code that said the right way to live is in a way that enables you to live a beautiful, flourishing life in harmony with other people, leaving each other free to do their own thing so we can trade with each other and all of that. So you were given that alternative, or any other alternative in this same world. Mm-hmm. You were given another alternative of, well, people should be forced to do things against their will, or people should suffer as much as possible, or anything like that. Which of those alternatives would you choose?
The first.
Yeah, see, if we're here in this world thinking about the real facts that are before mm-hmm. us, and when there are a bunch of young people here from all over the world, and what they need to know is, how am I supposed to act in this life? They're not right. jonesing for, how am I supposed to act in those made-up worlds?
Yeah, I mean,
the made-up stuff is fun. Harry Potter is fun, but it's not the thing we need to focus on.
Those made-up worlds are, of course, supposed to be used as a tool to investigate the definition of terms.
But
it's sort of like imagining if you were to say that your shirt was part of your body, an intrinsic part of your body, and I said, well, can you imagine a situation in which you didn't have your shirt on? And you say yes. Even though that world doesn't exist, it helps us to make a point in the real world that your shirt is not identical with your body. And similarly, if you say that ethics is identical to, well, I shouldn't say identical, but is intrinsically reliant upon the concept of death, then we construct another imaginary world where we separate them out. And we say that, well, here's a world in which ethics exists, but death does not. I think that shows that in principle it can't be about life and death. But also, I mean, you asked me which of those worlds I'd prefer, but that's just it. It's a preference. I mean, if I could live my life in fear every day for the rest of my life, or live my life in pleasure for the rest of my life, I'd pick the latter, not because I think there's some objective rule of the universe that somehow gives me a prescription to do so, but just because I prefer it, because it's an emotionally preferable state for me. And that's how I approach that kind of dichotomy as well. That's why I would prefer to live in that world.
Yeah.
And I suppose what I'd want to ask you in return as well is that, there are so many things. I mean, for example, I want to know how your egoistic ethic, your rational egoism that you derive from Objectivism and Ayn Rand, that the rational thing to do, and indeed the ethical thing to do, therefore the thing you're mandated to do, is whatever's going to help your survival as a creature. I want to know where something intuitively unethical like torturing an animal comes into this. Because when I say, well, why should I care about somebody else? It's very easy to say, well, my survival prospects are actually much increased by living in a society where we treat each other nicely, where we have a social safety net, this kind of stuff. Fine, but if somebody tortures a dog, burns them alive on a fire or something because of the pleasure that they receive from doing so, I can't see any way for an objectivist of this brand to say that what they're doing is wrong. It in no way upsets their own survival. It in no way makes them closer to death. In fact, the sort of hedonistic release that they get from it may indeed bolster their life and make it more worth living and possibly even go on for longer for that reason. So how does your worldview capture the intuitive immorality of something like animal abuse?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think it's an intuitive issue. I think it's just a matter of fact that it is profoundly immoral to torture an animal for no good reason. So, I mean, I'm not against eating animals. I am against unnecessarily putting any animal through pain.
Sure.
And the reason is for the same reason that I hold life as the standard of value for human beings. Life as the standard of value is broader than just for human beings. Life is the standard of value for a flower.
He just cannot let go of this life and death argument, and I have a feeling Alex is going to keep cornering him on that. But I do like where he's going with this, because the core of his argument does not necessitate that humans be the subjects of either suffering or death before we're able to ascribe some ethic to it, whether it's right or wrong. That was such an easy question to rebut that I feel like Alex might be beginning to grasp at straws now.
Life as the standard of value is broader than just for human beings. Life is the standard of value for a flower, let alone a dog. I think it's wrong to just kick a beautiful flower. So I don't think it's immoral on the order that if you do that, you should be, or certainly it shouldn't be illegal to do that. But I don't think it's even immoral on the grounds that if you see somebody do that, you would hold them in contempt for the rest of your life. If I saw somebody torturing a dog, I would hold the person in contempt for the rest of my life. But let's stick with the flower, because I want to take this to an extreme.
Yep.
A flower is a beautiful thing. It's alive. It would be absolutely nihilistic to kick a flower dead just for the hell of kicking a flower dead. It's like hatred of the good for being good. It's hatred of life for being alive. So
blaspheming the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. And so there's a real richness and depth to this idea that life is the standard of value, because it is broader than just human life as the standard of moral value. It means that that life is profoundly unique and important because it is the thing to which values pertain. It's the only thing to which values pertain.
And that sounds very attractive, but for your ideas here.
This idea about the flower, I'm not sure he would be able to make without his life and death argument, so maybe that does have some value after all, because I wouldn't be able to make that same argument with suffering alone, right? Because I don't know that a flower is suffering. I have no evidence of that, but he's able to make that argument that perhaps it's wrong to uproot a flower unnecessarily simply because you feel like it, because of that life and death argument that he's used as an anchor here. I'm not sure I would still jump onto that bandwagon simply because of this possibility of it, but let's see, maybe there's even more utility to it than just that.
Life is profoundly unique and important because it is the thing to which values pertain. It's the only thing to which values pertain.
And that sounds very attractive, but for your ideas here or your worldview to be objective, you'd need to say that to the nihilist who says, I just don't care. I just want to pick that flower. I honestly, I just don't recognize what you're talking about. You have to tell them that they are wrong, and presumably in a way that you could describe to them. So a moment ago when we were talking about life and death being intrinsic to ethics, there's an important distinction to make. There can be the life and death of the person doing the action, or the life and the death of the thing that's being acted upon. So it seemed like a moment ago you were saying that my ability to live and die is a requirement for my ability to be moral in my interactions with other people. But if a flower, though it can live and die, is not a moral agent. A flower is not the kind of thing that can have a moral course of action. Maybe that's because it doesn't have free will. Maybe also that's because it doesn't have emotions. Right? I'm saying both of these can be explained on our worldviews equally. But when you say that it's wrong for me to kick that flower, if I'm going to be a rational egoist, which means that for me personally, my life is what matters, my survival prospects, me alone. And even other human beings, their survival prospects only matter insofar.
May I just correct one thing there? Because I don't want you to go on with a mistake.
I want to make sure I'm getting you right.
So egoism does not hold that your life and your life alone matters to you. Mm-hmm. It means that your life is your primary concern. Mm-hmm. A human life consists of all sorts of relationships that are extremely important to you.
Yeah, but so they're important to you.
Yes.
So that their value again is...
Yeah, but they are important.
They're important, but they're only important insofar as they serve me.
They're important to you. There's direct importance, and then there's all sorts of indirect importance. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, there are people in China right now, or in India right now, who I don't know, and you don't know. We don't know anything about what they're doing.
Yep.
But if they come to my mind, as they just have, because I've brought them up, do I wish them well? Yes, because they might be the person who invents the next thing that's just awesome for human life, right? So,
well, I wish them well, even if they were not.
Okay, either way, but yeah. The point is that the potential in human beings is a valuable thing in and of itself.
I'm less attracted to that than I am about the whole kicking flowers thing, because I like to think that somebody who I've never met in China is doing well, regardless of their contributions. Indeed, even if they take more than they give throughout their life, maybe through no fault of their own, maybe they're disabled, and so they rely on state benefits and don't have a very high-paying job, and so spend a lot of taxpayers' money for themselves and don't give very much in return. I'd still wish them well.
Oh, I certainly would too.
And not just as a product of, well, if I do that on the whole, if I practically adopt this life philosophy, it will be better for me. Although maybe I would say that I'm essentially doing that in an emotional level, because when I think of that person, it makes me upset, and that's why I care about them. So it's not a criticism, by the way, for me to say that this is, all about me, because the emotivist has to say that too. But the problem is that if even other human beings only matter insofar as they benefit me, then I can kind of see how that might be the case. I mean, you say you care about that man in China because he might invent the next big medicine, but a dog is not going to do that.
Yeah, but
a flower is certainly not going to do that.
You're still, I think, and I've been unclear, so my apology. I'm not saying that human beings matter only insofar as they matter to you. Mm-hmm. For the same reason that a flower matters enough that to kick it over needlessly, I mean, it's one thing to clip a flower to put it in a vase for your dinner, to have a bouquet on the table. But if you're just kicking it over nihilistically, you could say, well, the flower doesn't matter to me, so I kicked it over. Mm-hmm. But the problem with that is you're treating a living thing with contempt.
But what's the problem with doing that?
The problem with doing that is that life is the very thing that gives rise to the business of valuing and of conceptual terms that we use for beauty. I mean, beauty, anything like that. I'm not saying it matters to you in the same way or to the same degree as other things. I'm saying it's nihilistic. It's treating life as if it's of no value. And if I were to say, well, I don't care about other people because I don't know them at all. Now, there's no reason for me to have them in my mind. I can't keep 8 billion people in my mind and live my life. But if you bring it up, if you say, do you care about somebody on the other side of the world living a beautiful life as against a not beautiful life, my thing is, I want everybody to live a beautiful life. And it's not only because they will have some connection to me, although that potential is extremely important. It's because I have a reverence for life because life is the standard of value.
Yeah, it seems to me, if I may, that this is arguing in a circle, though, unfortunately, because I'm asking you to justify your view that life has value, that life is the value-giving thing in the universe. If there can be such thing as a value, life is where it comes from. And I say, well, if that's the case, then what if the person who kicks the flower and doesn't care? And you say, well, the problem with that person is that they're not treating life as if it has intrinsic value.
Yeah.
But that's the very thing that I'm trying to get you to establish.
Got it.
And so it can't be a response to my objection. I need to introduce you to the person who does not think that life is intrinsically valuable. I mean, I don't think life is intrinsically valuable.
I don't think it's intrinsically valuable either. So there's something I need to clarify there.
And so kicking that flower, if you say that, well, the problem with that is that it treats
But if you bring it up, if you say, do you care about somebody on the other side of the world, I think, and I've been unclear, so my apology. I'm not saying that human beings matter only insofar as they matter to you. For the same reason that a flower matters enough that to keep
here or your worldview to be objective, you'd need to say that to the nihilist who says
that your life is
though it can live and die, it's not a moral agent. A flower is not the kind of thing that can have a moral action. Maybe it doesn't have free will. Maybe it doesn't have emotions. And both these can be explained by worldviews equally. But when you say that it's wrong for me to pick that flower, if I'm a rational egoist, which means that for me personally, my life is what matters. My survival prospect, me alone, and even other human beings, their survival prospect only matter insofar. Because when I'm asking you to follow you, and my well,
relationships are extremely important.
You can have that
Which means that living that life is values pertain. It's the only thing to which values pertain.
and that sounds very attractive, but
it means value because it is broader than just human life as the standard of moral value. It means that that life is profoundly unique and important because it is the thing to which values pertain. It's the only thing to which values pertain.
and that sounds very attractive, but for your ideas here or your worldview to be objective, you'd need to say that to the nihilist who says, I just don't care. I just want to pick that flower. I honestly, I just don't recognize what you're talking about. You have to tell them that they are wrong, and presumably in a way that you could describe to them. So a moment ago when we were talking about life and death being intrinsic to ethics, there's an important distinction to make. It can be the life and death of the person doing the action, or the life and the death of the thing that's being acted upon. So it seemed like a moment ago you were saying that my ability to live and die is a requirement for my ability to be moral in my interactions with other people. But if a flower, though it can live and die, is not a moral agent. A flower is not the kind of thing that can have a moral course of action. Maybe that's because it doesn't have free will. Maybe also that's because it doesn't have emotions. Right? I'm saying both of these can be explained on our worldviews equally. But when you say that it's wrong for me to kick that flower, if I'm going to be a rational egoist, which means that for me personally, my life is what matters, my survival prospects, me alone. And even other human beings, their survival prospects only matter insofar.
May I just correct one thing there? Because I don't want you to go on with a mistake.
I want to make sure I'm getting you right.
So egoism does not hold that your life and your life alone matters to you. It means that your life is your primary concern. A human life consists of all sorts of relationships that are extremely important to you.
Yeah, but so they're important to you.
Yes.
So that their value again is...
Yeah, but they are important.
They're important, but they're only important insofar as they serve me.
They're important to you. There's direct importance, and then there's all sorts of indirect importance. So, for instance, there are people in China right now or in India right now who I don't know, and you don't know. We don't know anything about what they're doing. But if they come to my mind, as they just have, because I've brought them up, do I wish them well? Yes, because they might be the person who invents the next thing that's just awesome for human life, right? So,
well, I wish them well, even if they were not.
Okay, either way, but the point is the potential in human beings is a valuable thing in and of itself.
I'm less attracted to that than I am about the whole kicking flowers thing, because I like to think that somebody who I've never met in China is doing well, regardless of their contributions. Indeed, even if they take more than they give throughout their life, maybe through no fault of their own. Maybe they're disabled, and so they rely on state benefits and don't have a very high-paying job, and so spend a lot of taxpayers' money for themselves and don't give very much in return. I'd still wish them well.
Oh, I certainly would too.
And not just as a product of, well, if I do that on the whole, if I practically adopt this life philosophy, it will be better for me. Although maybe I mean, I would say that I'm essentially doing that in an emotional level, because when I think of that person, it makes me upset, and that's why I care about them. So it's not a criticism, by the way, for me to say that this is, all about me, because the emotivist has to say that too. But the problem is that if even other human beings only matter insofar as they benefit me, then I can kind of see how that might be the case. I mean, you say you care about that man in China because he might invent the next big medicine, but a dog is not going to do that.
Yeah, but
a flower is certainly not going to do that.
You're still, I think, and I've been unclear, so my apology. I'm not saying that human beings matter only insofar as they matter to you. For the same reason that a flower matters.
I really think they're both getting sidetracked by things that are besides the point. And I still do believe that a lot of this stems back to Craig's insistence on life and death being intrinsic to morality, because he's essentially extending that to flowers, in which Alex is pointing out that, well, sure, life and death does apply to flowers, but there are other requisites for human beings that make that connection possible between life and death and morality that flowers don't have, i.e. emotions, i.e. volition, and all of these other things. So given that, how exactly are we imputing morality on our actions towards flowers? The way I would extend my argument about suffering to encompass things such as flowers, given that they don't feel suffering, they don't have volition or emotions as far as we know it, is simply that the sort of person who would treat such living things with contempt and unnecessarily devalue their life is probably the same sort of person who would not have a distinct line between such living things and other living things which do have those emotions and do have those values and do have volition and all of that. And I don't think that's that much of a stretch to make compared to Craig's argument here, because assuming the person is educated enough to know that flowers and plants are also living, they would probably take pause before stomping out a flower to death. Unless, of course, something else is off with that person. I mean, I could be wrong here, but it just feels very intuitive. But it's not a hill that I'm willing to die on, because I could forego this argument about flowers, and the core essence of my argument based on suffering would still hold, unlike his, which is based on life and death, in which case he feels the need to extend that to the margins to include flowers, which he seems to be being cornered about.
You could say, well, the flower doesn't matter to me, so I kicked it over. But the problem with that is you're treating a living thing with contempt.
But what's the problem with doing that?
The problem with doing that is that life is the very thing that gives rise to the business of valuing and of conceptual terms that we use for beauty. I mean, beauty, anything like that. I'm not saying it matters to you in the same way or to the same degree as other things. I'm saying it's nihilistic. It's treating life as if it's of no value. And if I were to say, well, I don't care about other people because I don't know them at all. Now, there's no reason for me to have them in my mind. I can't keep 8 billion people in my mind and live my life. But if you bring it up, if you say, do you care about somebody on the other side of the world living a beautiful life as against a not beautiful life, my thing is, I want everybody to live a beautiful life. And it's not only because they will have some connection to me, although that potential is extremely important. It's because I have a reverence for life, because life is the standard of value.
Yeah, it seems to me, if I may, that this is arguing in a circle, though, unfortunately, because I'm asking you to justify your view that life has value, that life is the value-giving thing in the universe. If there can be such thing as a value, life is where it comes from. And I say, well, if that's the case, then what if the person who kicks the flower and doesn't care? And you say, well, the problem with that person is that they're not treating life as if it has intrinsic value.
Yeah.
But that's the very thing that I'm trying to get you to establish.
Got it.
And so it can't be a response to my objection. I need to introduce you to the person who does not think that life is intrinsically valuable. I mean, I don't think life is intrinsically valuable.
So I don't think it's intrinsically valuable either. So there's something I need to clarify there.
And so kicking that flower, if you say that, well, the problem with that is that it treats living things with contempt, and I say, well, so what?
Got it.
And so it can't be a response to my objection.
So there's something I need to clarify there.
And so kicking that flower, if you say that, well, the problem with that is that it treats living things with contempt, and I say, well, so what? I mean, the idea that you shouldn't treat living things with contempt is the very thing that I'm trying to get you to establish, if you see what I'm saying.
So life...
Alex is asking the question, if I introduce you to a nihilist who doesn't believe that life has any intrinsic value, let alone one in which we can derive morality out of, how do you go about convincing this person that life does in fact have meaning without simply resorting back to your initial point that life has meaning? Life has meaning because life has meaning is a circular logic, as Alex has rightfully pointed out. But this same question would not be able to apply to suffering as far as I can tell, because it would be something like, let me introduce you to someone who believes there is no suffering. How do you go about convincing this person that there is actually suffering on which we can derive morality out of? You can easily draw the person's attention back to some moment in their lives where something happened that did not seem to have any rhyme or reason behind it. And as the person, if that's not enough, imagine everybody around you felt that way. Imagine there was no hope in sight of an end to that. Imagine that is the same for everybody who is ever going to live after you. And tell me that that is not something that is bad in every definition of the idea bad. I think anybody who is able to follow that reasoning would probably acknowledge that, yes, that is bad. And again, yet another roadblock for Craig's arguments here. I'm beginning to worry that he might try to carry on this same line of reasoning throughout the video and not actually get to the essence of the conversation, because I'm very curious how Alex would respond to the suffering arguments, and he hasn't been really given a chance to respond to this, because I feel that might actually put Alex on the defensive as opposed to Craig, who seems to have been on the defensive throughout this entire video because he's not able to make this connection as stable as he's trying to. I mean, the fact that Craig did touch briefly on the suffering argument and Alex's only response to that was to make the hedonist accusation, which was an easy rebuttal for Craig, at which point he pivoted back to attacking Craig's life and death argument, which is a far easier argument to break down, is indication to me about how Craig is too committed to a flimsy argument here and still does not seem to realize it.
So life to any human being, when only human beings choose the option of staying alive or not. So this can't apply to animals that don't have that kind of choice, and it certainly cannot apply to plants. So when we as human beings are thinking about the value of animals or plants to us, it's substantially removed from the normal way that we're talking about values. I went to the flower because you brought up somebody kicking a dog, and I wanted to make the further extreme point that I think contempt for life generally. But life itself, so my life does not have intrinsic value. Why does my life have value? It is the way that I hold this, and this is essentially Ayn Rand's view as well. We either choose to remain in existence or not. That's a choice that, as adults, we all have. I think the youngest recorded suicide in history is something like a 6-year-old, but that's very rare, and normally it doesn't start until, the possibility doesn't even come into existence until 10 or 12, and then that's pretty damn rare too. So when you're a child, you don't even have this idea that there's an option of exiting. But when we get to the point that we do understand that that is an option, you then, at least implicitly, are regularly making the choice to remain in existence, to remain alive. You could leave. You always have that option. Now, there are good reasons for most people to remain in existence. Life is full of wonder and full of potential and full of possibility. So people tend to make the choice to stay in existence far more often than not. But it is the very choice to remain alive that gives rise to the need of values. It's only the choice to live that makes valuing possible. So if I said, I don't want to live anymore, but then my next question was, what should I go after? What should I value? You would look at me like I was crazy.
Well,
if you don't want to live, you don't need anything. So the point here is simply that in terms of logical dependence, the choice to remain alive precedes any evaluation.
I'm not 100% sure about this. I'm actually far less than 100% sure about this. For example, trivially, the person considering suicide who says, I don't want to live anymore, what should I do? If I'm just willing to grant that they've made a correct evaluative judgment there, it seems like you're saying I must say something like, well, that's a silly question. You can't ask what should I do if you don't want to stay alive. But of course, if they just sit there and sit around, they'll be there for at least 3-4 days, just sitting there doing nothing, and then they'll eventually die. But I could say, but if you go up to the top of this building and throw yourself off, you'll die a lot more quickly. You'll achieve your goal much more quickly. And so given your evaluative goal, that's what you should do. And so you've still got this system of values which imply certain things that you should or shouldn't do.
Well, you're assuming they want to die more quickly. I was just starting with the point they don't want to remain in existence. And you're just saying, well, there's a faster way to do it.
Yeah.
If you don't want to remain in existence, you can just sit down and in short order, 3 days or so, you'll be gone. Or you can do something to make it happen faster. So there's no substantive disagreement there. My point is that unless you want to live, there's no cause for action.
Yeah. So again, there are a few things to say here. One thing is to say that this choice of living and dying seems to me one that you can't impart objectivity into.
You can't impart what?
Objectivity into. I mean, would you claim that it's objectively the right decision to stay alive? Right?
No,
if that's the case, then...
Yeah. So I hold that it is both, the choice to remain in existence, to remain living, is both in a technical sense, pre-moral and even pre-rational. And the reason that it's pre-moral is because you don't need values until you've made the choice.
Okay.
And the reason it's pre-rational is because reason only has use value.
Sure. And
you don't need reason or reasons or knowledge or truth or anything unless you choose to live. So the choice to live is just fundamental in that sense.
If finding the basis of ethics is starting with our moral claims that we make, it's wrong to murder, and saying, well, why? Well, we shouldn't murder because we shouldn't treat life with malice. Well, why? Because we should, and you sort of keep asking why, and then you eventually get something like, because you should remain alive. That should is either going to be objective or it's not, and if it's not, then the entire edifice that you've built upon it
it's not
going
that
to be subjective
you
as well.
should remain alive. So if I take Frederick Douglass and put him in a cage and treat him like a subhuman animal and then put him out in the fields and make him do my work and then put him back in a cage at night, so just Mach 1 slavery, what is wrong with this? Why is slavery wrong? Well, because he is a human being, and a human life consists precisely in acting on his judgment and pursuing his values. So it's wrong for me to do that to him because he's a human being.
Why does that matter to you?
Pardon?
Why does it matter to you?
It matters to me because when we're talking about moral principles, we're talking about principles, and principles are things that apply to all of the units in the classification we're talking about. We're talking about human beings, and human beings have a certain nature. I, of course, want to live my life and have a beautiful life, but I don't own her life or his life or your life. Your life belongs to you. So this is where just as the requirements of life give rise to the principles of morality, one of the principles of morality that gives rise to a proper political system is the moral principle of individual rights.
I don't see what the principle is here, because a moment ago I thought that we were talking about rational egoism, that for me, the thing that matters is my survival and flourishing.
Yeah.
And now it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're suggesting that somehow my recognition that, I desire my own flourishing in life is somehow indicative that every person has this intrinsic value amongst them that I should respect, even if it wasn't of benefit to me.
So I don't think every person has intrinsic value. Every person has value insofar as he or she chooses to live and is respecting the rights of others to do the same. So if a jihadist comes after Ayaan Hirsi Ali and tries to kill her, and I'm there and I shoot him dead, I did not destroy a value. this guy had no value at all. He had turned himself into a subhuman, sub-animal creature who had no value at all.
But
So
suppose he...
my point here is simply that human life is not intrinsically valuable. It's valuable if you choose to live and if you stick with the program of living as a human being as against living as a not human being.
I think we might be getting confused between what I said earlier about like the prospect of living and dying in the person committing the moral act and the person upon whom the act is being committed.
I wish Alex would go back to that previous argument he was making about someone who wants to commit suicide, because there is a lot of parallel between that and a suicide bomber. Other than the stark difference, I would say, in motive, where one feels like life is hopeless and not worth living, and the other feels like they're going to heaven after they commit suicide and meet in 70 virgins, there isn't any other difference there. So if Craig is making the point that the value of people's lives depend on their own desire to stay alive, then why should we value someone who wants to commit suicide's life? Because I'm pretty sure Craig would acknowledge that, yes, we should value such a life, even though the person has decided that it's not worth living anymore. And Craig then might say something like, well, the motives do matter, and the fact that they want, one person wants to take the lives of others is relevant here. Well, I would say, well, we can imagine someone who wants to commit suicide because they think life is hopeless, but at the same time, even though they're not going to go out and kill other people, they think other people's lives are just as valueless. So in this sense, there is still a similar motive between those two people. The course of action might be different, but I don't think Craig would have a way to rebut that, given that now we have two people who do not value either their lives or the lives of others. And how do we go about treating these two people? Are we to treat both of them the same? Are we to kill both of them, as he's saying we should do with the suicide bomber? Or are we to treat them separately? And why should we treat them separately, given that they both have similar motives behind their convictions? I practically wrapped up the video, but then as I watched the remainder, I stumbled across a few audience questions that really fleshed out the observations that I had during the debate. So I'd like to show these to you.
So my question is for both of y'all, and it's about the idea of life being the objective standard of value, or moral value. And see, there can be an equivocation of what you mean by life. And I think Alex is pointing this out when he gave that thought experiment of the immortality. He's basically, that thought experiment shows that physical survival is not the standard moral value, because Craig, you said ethics would still exist even in that scenario, even though your physical survival is guaranteed. So
what is the question?
Yeah, the question is, so Ayn Rand talks about spiritual survival, psychological survival. And my question is, what do you think of that being the objective standard of value? That standard, that survival, that would even apply to psychopaths, because they would have their own type of consciousness, their own type of ego, that they would have to be, they have to act a certain way to promote that type of survival, even if it's a different type of ego.
What is your question?
What's your thoughts on that standard value?
Yeah.
I really like the way he asked that question, as long-winded as it might have seemed, because he's pointing out that, Craig, you don't need to rest all your arguments on this life and death, axiom, because you've already acknowledged that suffering is really what is at the core of it. You've already acknowledged that even when life and death is not an issue anymore, there is still suffering present. So why not maintain that instead of life and death? And he's going an additional step further by pointing out how the argument about psychopaths, whether or not or why it is wrong for psychopaths to kill other people and why it is wrong not to kill a psychopath, he's essentially pointing out that as an example of how the suffering argument could argue that way better than the arguments that Craig has been using thus far about life and death. And as I've said throughout this video, I think most of the points that Alex cornered Craig with would have been completely avoided had he stuck with the suffering argument. So again, I must say that I've been a bit disappointed that he was so adamant about maintaining that point, But he did the best he could with that commitment that he had. He was consistent, if nothing else. So I can't accuse him of inconsistency.
They have to act a certain way to promote that type of survival, even if it's a different type
What
of
is your question?
What's your thoughts on that
Okay.
standard value?
Yeah. So Rand holds, and I agree with her, that human life, the idea that human life is the standard of value, does not mean mere survival. It means survival qua man, as she put it, which means given the full capacities of man. It means essentially flourishing. And she even said that life and happiness are in effect two sides of the same coin. Right? They're two perspectives on the same achievement. You achieve happiness by pursuing your life-serving values and succeeding in those pursuits, and then you have this thing called happiness. But the reason that life is the standard of value and happiness is not is because happiness is simply a state of consciousness, where life is a state of biological existence plus consciousness, so it captures both of them. And you can see this by the fact that you can be alive but not be happy, but you can't not be alive, but you can't be happy if you're not alive, right? So one of them is more fundamental than the other. So she does not mean, and she would say you would be freezing the abstraction of life if you just meant your heart is still beating. She means life in the full capacity of a human being, which is why virtues and values are necessary and freedom is necessary so that you can live that way. Again, if you put somebody like Frederick Douglass in a cage and treat him like an animal, he can't live as a human being. That's why slavery is wrong. So that's the essential answer to that. Thanks.
I see where he's going with this, and that's the most he's explained why he's maintained that life and death and not suffering or well-being is at the core of values. And I guess according to him, life and death is something that is a biological fact. It's something that is undeniable regardless of what organism you are, what species you are. It is simply the fact that there is living things and there are living things and then there are non-living things. Of course, things like viruses and certain types of bacteria confound that fact, but that is a separate conversation that I don't think I need to get into. I think it might be somewhat relevant to this, but I don't want to overcomplicate this. So I'll stick to living things as most people know it in the most conventional sense of that idea. The reason I still disagree with that is because I think he is being a little too narrow in his description of happiness. And this is why I really like Sam Harris's description of this, because it is far more encompassing. His word of choice there is well-being. Well-being is not simply the happiness that can easily be accused of hedonism, as Alex did earlier, but rather a richer form of happiness that can be illuminated when we talk about the extremes. So on the one extreme, as I said earlier, we have the maximal pain and suffering possible. On the other extreme, we have the maximal pleasure possible. Now, we need not have experienced either of these two extremes to know that they are possible, regardless of our physiological makeup. So the fact that someone might be devoid of all emotions and feelings does not mean that they are outside of that spectrum. It simply means that they're more on the neutral side of that spectrum, which we can call good, right? It's not ideal, it's not painful, it's just simply neutral. Most people lean one way or the other, and we can feel these emotions regardless of our own physiological makeup. And another reason why I think Sam Harris's description of well-being really captures the nuances here is because he doesn't describe well-being as this static, definite thing that everybody should strive towards, but rather a bunch of different peaks, right? Again, if we think about it as mountains, we can think of the well-being, the optimal well-being, as different peaks on this landscape. So every peak might look different depending on the circumstances, the people, the personalities involved. All of these things could shape a certain ideal that might not be ideal for other people on a different peak. But given the fact that things have just coalesced that way, it just so happens to be their peak, right? And that same peak might be the trough for a different group of people. But that is recognized in this moral landscape. And by the way, that book that Sam Harris really elucidates a lot of these points in. It's called The Moral Landscape. I would highly recommend it. Anyways, I hope that clarifies my own insistence that I think well-being, or at least a more holistic idea of happiness, is a far more durable argument to rest this moral objectivity claim on than the one that he's been making so far about life and death. I get, again, why he feels that is more stable, but I think it just has way too many issues, as Alex has consistently pointed out throughout this talk. And moreover, Craig himself admitted as much when he acquiesced that yes, even in the absence of life and death as an issue, suffering is an issue. So it seems almost like he's trying to agree with it, but at the same time, not really commit to it. And that's what I haven't understood throughout this video. Because he obviously understands that point. He obviously understands, even in his own description not too long ago, that life and death does not simply mean that biological fact, but it also includes the happiness and the richness and the meaning that we derive from living, right? So we can capture all of that in the simple idea of well-being without narrowing it so much to that basic idea of life and death, which he always comes back to for some reason.
Why virtues and values are necessary and freedom is necessary so that you can live that way. Again, if you put somebody like Frederick Douglass in a cage and treat him like an animal, he can't live as a human being. That's why slavery is wrong. So that's the essential answer to that. Thanks.
I would just like to add that I think implausibly suggests to me that a long unhappy life is more valuable than a short happy one.
A long unhappy life is more valuable? I don't think that, I would have to think about that kind of calculation, but I think there's no reason to make those kinds of calculations, because what you have as any individual is, you have whatever your capacities are. I mean, if you have cancer and you're going to die, and you know that in a few years, then you want to live in a certain way during that time. If you don't, then your expectation is, hey, I want to live as long as I can and as healthfully as I can and as happily as I can. And there's no reason for anybody to play with the thought experiment, would you rather live a short life that's really happy or a long life that's not happy? There's no need for that hypothesis.
You might not need to make that choice, but it would still be true of two lives that in fact exist, one of which is very, very happy and 25 years long, and one which is quite unhappy, maybe still majority happy, but still quite unhappy and lives for, say, 35 years old.
Perhaps, but the comparison is unnecessary, because if you just talk about two people, you'd say, well, this guy died a few years ago and only lived for 30 years and he was really happy, and this guy lived to 80 and he was medium happy. Which one of these guys had a better life? I don't know. You'd have to ask them and bring that guy back and make the comparison. Nothing hangs on this question.
Well,
it doesn't make any difference, because individuals have only the control of their own lives, and they can take the actions to make their lives the best they can be, which in my view is what we all should do. And if they don't do that, it's a tragedy. And if you have a short life, that's tragic. And if you have a long life and it's not happy, I think that's tragic.
It's an important meta-ethical question. I mean, you might think there's no import in comparing two different kinds of lives, but if there are just, in fact, two lives that we know, because they've been lived and there have been thorough self-report studies into these two lives, one of them is happier and 25 years old when they die, and one of them is less happy and 30 years old when they die, I would say that I'd rather have the 25-year-old's life, even though there's less life.
That's fine, and that could be your preference. I have no position on it, because my position is always that each individual should simply do the best he can to live a beautiful life for himself. Sure. And so I get no value out of that comparison. I just wouldn't take a position on it.
Everybody should strive to have a beautiful life for themselves. As idealistic as that sounds awfully subjective for someone who claims to be arguing from a moral objectivist point of view. And there is a lot of import from deciding whether or not you want to live long and miserable or short and happy, because this is a decision that we all have to make day in, day out, through the foods that we eat, through the friends that we have. A lot of the time, our short-term interest conflicts with our long-term interest, and we often have to decide, do we want to eat this unhealthy food and live a miserable life later on, or do we want to sacrifice the pleasures of taste or not working out or whatever it may be and live a better life in the future, or a mix depending on what the context is. So I really do think this has import, and I think Craig has continued to avoid this question throughout because he simply does not have an answer to why life and death should take primacy over suffering. Let's move on to the next question that fleshed this out.
Hi, thanks. That was great. My question is for Craig. So earlier on in the debate, you said that it was implicitly or just, it was wrong to torture animals or dogs, but that eating them and killing them isn't necessarily wrong. And this seemed to me
That what isn't necessarily wrong?
eating and killing animals.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And this seemed to be a bit contradictory to your overall theory, which seems to prioritize life and then only suffering if you can link it to life. And I'm assuming your response to this would be something along the lines of there's some utility to eating animals, but there really isn't in torturing animals. But what if we did have, I guess, a population where there is more utility in torturing animals? I'm wondering if your position would change and if you would say something along the lines of that's not realistic, those would be psychopaths. I would just like to add quickly that around 2 to 10% of the population are psychopaths, so I think washing our hands of this population, and people can also torture animals, not be psychopaths.
I need you to restate your question.
Yeah, sorry, I have a
concisely,
few
because
caveats.
Otherwise, I won't be able to answer.
Yeah, how would you deal with that contradiction between saying torturing animals is wrong, but killing and eating them is okay when your moral theory seems to prioritize life
Okay.
over suffering?
So there's a difference between animals and people in that animals are not conceptual. They don't have a rational faculty. They don't form concepts. They can't respect rights, let alone think about them. So, if a tiger's charging you, you say, "Hey, wait! I'm a human being. I live. I have my own life, and you have your own. You're going to be dead before you finish your sentence, right? Because they're not in that category of things that can think this way. They don't live by using their rational faculty. They live by using instincts, and their instincts are devastatingly dangerous to us if we, don't use our minds to understand what the differences are between animals. Now, that said, life, as long as it is not threatening you, is life. And if you disvalue it in such a nihilistic way as kicking a dog or kicking a flower or something like that, again, I'm not going to hold you in contempt for the rest of your life. I see you kicking a flower, but I would be like, that's a really sort of disturbed person, or maybe she's really angry right now.
Isn't that a bit of a judgment, though? A value judgment, that's nihilistic versus killing and eating animals?
You can make value judgments that are not moral value judgments, right? Flowers have values, even though they don't make moral value judgments. They have values because they go after things that support their lives. So you have to differentiate between values for things generally and moral values, which only come in the sphere of human choice. Human values are chosen, and we don't have automatic values. We have to decide what we're going to go after, and that's why we need to think about it and use our reason.
Well, then why did he bring up this flower thing, if I recall, as a way to illustrate how even if the thing is not human, even if the thing does not have rights and emotions and all of these things, that we still need to treat them with respect? This distinction between moral values and values I find to be extremely confusing and a semantic game, because he's saying that there are gradations to values. There are moral values, and then there are values, right? But this is also coming from someone who has established throughout this video that life and death are the things that create morality, that when there is something that is taken away from life, that then is being immoral. When there is something that's added to life, that is being immoral. But how is it that when we come to flowers, that doesn't apply anymore? So we can take the life of a flower, but it's not immoral. Why is it not immoral? Well, because that is values. That is immoral. That is a mere value. That is not a moral value. What this shows is that there is something apparently more preeminent than life and death as a means of establishing moral objectivity, right? And what is that then, right? How exactly are we differentiating between moral values and values, if not through the life and death that he's been using this entire time? It's like when it comes to flowers, his principle that life is the core value seems to disappear, and apparently something else takes its place to determine whether it's a moral value or simply a value. I'm not sure what that is, and I'm not sure why flowers don't get that benefit, but other animals get that benefit.
Human values are chosen, And we don't have automatic values. We have to decide what we're going to go after. And that's why we need to think about it and use our reason to understand which values are good for our life and which are not. That's what morality is. It's the science that works on that project. So animals just simply don't have rights in the same way that human beings do. They don't have moral rights to act on their judgments so that they can live as human beings. The concept of right simply pertains to human beings, and in the history of its development, it only pertained to human beings. It's just, that's what the concept means. I am wide open to the possibility of another concept, and I've talked about this in the past, whereby we say there are certain kinds of things that deserve an interim level of respect. And I think dogs and certain kinds of animals should fall into that category. I'd love for some good philosopher to do some work on this, because I think torturing animals, putting animals in needless pain is absolutely abhorrent. But you cannot give the concept of rights to them because they simply
killing them is okay? Like, what about pigs, which are
can't
intelligent?
apply to an animal that's not conceptual.
But like, it seems like you think suffering is worse than killing them. Is that right?
That was actually
That's
going to be my next objection, which is that it seems to me that saying something like, I don't mind killing and eating animals, and in at least most circumstances of eating animals, that is unnecessary. I don't mind killing and eating them as long as we're not torturing them.
Yeah.
Seems to value the torturing over the life.
Yeah, so here's the difference there. An animal, when it is properly killed, meaning killed as quickly as possible without pain, which is the way that all people who slaughter animals for food should be slaughtering them. They should be killed without pain, and that can be done. If you're not doing that, that's wrong. And when you do that, here's the thing about animals. They don't have a future in mind. They're not projecting a future. They can't do that because they're not conceptual. So they're just in a different category than we are. And I know a lot of people don't like that fact, but I think it's almost self-evident that they're not in the same category that we are. So we just have to, and if you don't like my answer, that we would just have to agree to disagree on that. But that's the way I see it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I had some exact question, but I will just ask follow-up. So how is the difference when you say it's okay, it's not okay when individual just for their joy just eat a flower is not morally, objectively correct, but in that point, when we are society, when we don't need on large scale nutrition side, need to kill animals, then we will decide to not allow this thing.
I am not understanding your question.
I think if I may.
So what's the difference when you say it's incorrect when individual is eating flower and it's no need to do that? So when it's not needed to kill animals to get a nutrition we need, just because of the joy to kill animals, is it okay? So what's the difference?
Is the question, if we didn't need meat in order to live more healthfully and more happily, would I be against it?
Just assume it's just taste.
Okay. I would, personally, if I could eat meat that was factory produced and had all of the nutrients that meat that I like to eat has, I would much prefer to eat that and not have animals killed.
When you say like to eat, do you mean in terms of taste or in terms of the nutritional benefit?
Pardon?
When you say like to eat, all the meat that I would like to eat, do you mean in terms of taste or nutritional benefit?
I would package both of those together because, again, I don't think animals have rights, so it doesn't bother me greatly that we put animals to death to use them for food unless it is done with pain that is unnecessary, which I think is just on its face wrong. But I do want to live my life with the kind of joy and health that I get out of eating the meat that I eat now. And because I've never heard an argument for why or how animals could have rights, and I fully understand the argument for why and how human beings have rights, I simply make a sharp divide there.
I think what's your name?
Sandro.
Sanjo. Nice to meet you, Sanjo. I think Sanjo asked a question which proves you've been listening very closely, and I think this was a wonderful question. That earlier you said that to step on a flower just because you sort of enjoy it would be
There's
wrong.
a difference between immoral and...
Hold on,
and
but to kill an animal because you enjoy it, and I know that you're packaging in nutritional value, but let's say that we were able to get nutritional value, but it all tasted horrible, then you're talking about something like taste pleasure. Stepping on a flower because you enjoy it is horrible, nihilistic, but killing an animal because you enjoy it, because you enjoy the way it tastes, is not.
Yeah, there's a difference. So when you kick a flower for no reason, just life, dead, you're expressing a contempt for life. When you raise an animal, as most, as the good cattle farmers do, treating them well, feeding them. If you've watched that, what is that show, Yellowstone, and you watch how actual Montana cattle farmers love these animals, but when they put them to death quickly and as painlessly as possible. That is using the animal for good purposes, nutrition and joy. That is very different from kicking a flower for no good reason, just because life, beauty, kill. That, to me, is a nihilistic motive, and that's why I differentiate it, and there is nothing nihilistic about eating meat. So I regard that as a clear and distinct difference.
Okay, thank you.
We have 2 minutes, so we'll take a couple more questions. Thank you.
Thank you both. It's been a very thought-provoking panel. Craig, I would love to know your point of view. So life has value, right? 100% clear. What will happen if someone who doesn't value their lives and wants to kill themselves gets murdered by somebody else? And I don't mean like assisted suicide.
So a person wants to kill himself?
Yes,
And they
but
get
gets murdered but by somebody else.
Oh, and then they get murdered by someone else?
Yes.
Okay.
So it wasn't like a consensual thing. Will you think that's immoral?
So when you say they get murdered by somebody else, do you mean that they got assisted suicide?
No, like a gun or something.
Okay, so let's say I want to die, and I'm thinking about killing myself later today,
Yes.
but Alex pulls out a gun and shoots me
Yes.
dead. Okay.
Great
Is that
question.
immoral?
And does he?
That's a great question.
So just to make it graphic here on stage, oops, what happened to my thing? Fell off my ear there. Yes, that is still murder, because no one has a right to take anyone's life except the person himself. And it doesn't matter what those circumstances are. Now, what can happen morally is someone can contract with another person and say, look, I want to die, but I don't like the gruesome business of doing it myself. Would you assist me in this? I'm for the right to assisted suicide. But murder is murder, and you do not have the right to take anyone else's life. So if someone did that, I think they should be tried, and if they're tried and found guilty, they should be locked up for life.
Including the psychopath?
Including what?
The psychopath?
If it was the psychopath who did the killing, or the psychopath
Either way around.
who was killed. Yeah, it would be absolutely wrong to kill the psychopath, because although he is broken, in my view, now if it's a psychopath who has murdered someone, then he doesn't really even have a right to life, but he wouldn't be out killing people anyway. Presumably he'd be in jail. But yeah, even a psychopath who we can't let out because he will kill people, and we know that, but he has minimal rights. He has a right to remain in existence as long as we can keep the confines on him so that he can't act in a way that destroys other life. And if you got into the jail or wherever he's being held, hopefully it would be something more humane than a jail for this person. But and if you got in there and killed him, yes, you would be a murderer, and that would be wrong. You took a life that you don't have a right to take.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.